The sound of jet engines screaming overhead wasn't unusual in our neighborhood. We lived 15 miles from Whitman Air Force Base, so military aircraft were part of our daily soundtrack. But on that Tuesday afternoon in September, when Captain Marcus Thompson brought his F-16 Fighting Falcon down in our backyard, turning our half-acre of Kentucky bluegrass into an impromptu landing strip, every single person who had mocked my mental health struggles suddenly went very, very quiet. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Sarah Thompson, and this is the story of how my brother's dramatic intervention silenced an entire town's worth of whispers and gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever, my dignity. 3 months earlier, I was living what most people would consider a successful life. At 28, I had a corner office at Henderson Marketing Solutions in downtown Louisville, a BMW in the company parking garage, and a reputation as the woman who could close any deal. My colleagues called me the closer, and I wore that nickname like armor. I worked 14-hour days, pulled all-nighters on presentations, and hadn't taken a real vacation in 4 years. The cracks started showing on a Wednesday in June. I was in the middle of a client presentation for our biggest account, Riverside Financial Group, when the words just stopped coming. I stood there, laser pointer trembling in my hand, staring at 43 people in expensive suits, and my mind went completely blank. Not just forgot my line blank, but a terrifying, bottomless void where my thoughts used to be. "Sarah?" My boss, Richard Kellerman, prompted from the back of the room. "The Q3 projections?" I opened my mouth, but instead of quarterly numbers, what came out was a sound I'd never made before, a choking sob that seemed to come from somewhere deep in my chest. The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic 20 floors below. "I can't," I whispered, dropping the laser pointer. It clattered on the polished conference table like a gunshot. "I can't do this anymore." What happened next was a blur of concerned faces, hushed conversations, and someone, I think it was Jennifer from accounting, leading me out of the conference room while I hyperventilated into a paper bag. By 5 o'clock that evening, everyone in the building knew that Sarah Thompson, the closer, had suffered what the HR department delicately termed a workplace stress incident. The diagnosis came 2 weeks later, after a battery of tests and consultations: severe anxiety disorder with panic attacks, complicated by chronic stress, and what Dr. Elizabeth Morrison called emotional exhaustion syndrome. She prescribed medication, therapy sessions twice a week, and immediate medical leave from work. "Your nervous system is essentially running in overdrive," Dr. Morrison explained during our first session. "Imagine a car engine that's been redlining for years. Eventually, something has to give." I should have felt relieved to finally have an explanation for the racing heart, the sleepless nights, the constant feeling that I was drowning even when everything seemed fine on the surface. Instead, I felt ashamed. Mental illness wasn't something the Thompson family talked about. We were strong people, resilient people. My father, Robert Thompson, had served 2 tours in Vietnam and never spoke about what he'd seen. My mother, Patricia, had raised 3 children while working full-time as a nurse and never complained once. And then there was Marcus, 6 years older than me, a decorated Air Force pilot who flew F-16s like most people drove cars. He'd served 3 deployments, earned a Distinguished Flying Cross, and was being fast-tracked for promotion to major. The Thompson family didn't break down. We pressed forward. Except I had broken down, spectacularly and publicly, and now I was the family anomaly. The small town of Millbrook, Kentucky, where I'd grown up and still lived in a renovated Victorian house on Maple Street, thrived on gossip. Within a week of my medical leave becoming public knowledge, everyone from the mailman to the grocery store clerks knew about my nervous breakdown. The whispers followed me everywhere. "There goes Sarah Thompson," I heard Mrs. Gladys Hoffman tell her bridge club as I walked past the community center. Poor thing just couldn't handle the pressure. Always was a bit high-strung, even as a child. At Romano's Deli, where I'd been buying sandwiches for 15 years, the owner's wife, Maria, spoke in exaggerated whispers to other customers. "My cousin's daughter works at that marketing place. Says Sarah completely lost it during a big meeting. Started crying and everything. Such a shame. She seemed so put together. The pharmacist, Tom Bradley, who'd known me since I was 12, couldn't quite meet my eyes when I picked up my prescriptions. The bottles of Lexapro and Xanax felt heavy in my hands, like evidence of my failure. But the worst part wasn't the whispers or the pitying looks. It was how people started treating me like I was fragile, like I might shatter if they spoke too loudly or moved too quickly. My neighbor, Janet Mills, began speaking to me in the same soft, careful tone she used with her elderly mother who had dementia. "How are we feeling today, dear?" she'd ask, head tilted with exaggerated concern. "Are we taking our medications? Getting enough rest?" Quote. My childhood friend, Lisa Patterson, who I'd known since kindergarten, started avoiding me altogether. When we ran into each other at the farmer's market, she'd give me these tight, uncomfortable smiles and make excuses to cut our conversations short. "I wish I could chat longer, but Danny has soccer practice," she'd say, even though it was Thursday morning and Danny was clearly at school. The isolation was suffocating. I'd gone from being the closer, the woman everyone wanted on their team, to being the cautionary tale mothers whispered to their overachieving daughters. "Don't end up like Sarah Thompson," they'd warn. "Work-life balance is so important." My parents tried to be supportive, but their discomfort was obvious. Dad would pat my shoulder awkwardly and mutter things like, "You'll bounce back, kiddo. Thompsons always do." Mom brought me casseroles and asked careful questions about my therapy sessions, but I could see the confusion in her eyes. In her generation, you didn't talk about anxiety disorders. You just pushed through. Marcus was deployed in Afghanistan during the worst of it, but we talked on video calls when possible. He was the only person who didn't treat me differently, didn't speak in hushed tones or ask how I was coping. "Screw what those small-town gossips think," he said during one of our calls, his face pixelated on my laptop screen. "Half of them have never left the county, let alone faced real pressure. You worked yourself into the ground building something impressive, Sarah. There's no shame in needing to recharge." But even Marcus's support couldn't shield me from the daily humiliation of being known as the woman who'd cracked under pressure. Every trip to the grocery store, every walk through downtown, every encounter with neighbors or former colleagues was a reminder that I'd been reclassified in everyone's mind, from successful professional to cautionary tale. The panic attacks, which had started as occasional episodes during high-stress meetings, became more frequent and unpredictable. I'd be standing in line at the bank when my heart would start racing, my vision would tunnel, and I'd be convinced I was having a heart attack. The first few times, I ended up in the emergency room, only to be told it was anxiety and sent home with pamphlets about stress management. Dr. Morrison assured me this was normal, part of the healing process. "Your system is recalibrating," she explained. "It's going to take time to find a new equilibrium." But time felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. Every day I spent in therapy, every prescription bottle on my kitchen counter, every worried look from well-meaning neighbors was proof that Sarah Thompson, the closer, was gone. In her place was this fragile, medicated version of myself that everyone tiptoed around. By late August, the whispers had evolved into something more pointed. I overheard Janet Mills telling the UPS driver that she was concerned about property values, with someone having mental episodes on the street. At the post office, I caught the tail end of a conversation between two women from my high school class. "I heard she's on all kinds of medication now," one was saying. "My sister works at the pharmacy, says it's the heavy-duty stuff. I just hope she doesn't, snap completely." The implication was clear. I wasn't just the woman who'd had a breakdown. I was now potentially dangerous, unstable, someone to be watched and whispered about. The stigma clung to me like smoke, following me everywhere I went in our small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. What they didn't know was that Marcus had been making calls, pulling strings, and arranging something that would shut down their gossip permanently. Something that would remind everyone in Millbrook, Kentucky, exactly who the Thompson family was and what we were capable of. The morning of September 15th started like any other. I was in my kitchen, making coffee and trying to work up the courage to go to the farmer's market, when my phone rang. Marcus's name flashed on the screen. "Sarah, I need you to listen carefully." Marcus's voice came through the phone with an unusual urgency. In about 20 minutes, things are going to get very loud in your neighborhood. I need you to go outside and stand in your backyard. I almost dropped my coffee mug. Marcus, what are you talking about? Are you still in Afghanistan? Actually, I'm about 60 miles northwest of you right now, flying at 28,000 feet, he said, and I could hear the familiar sound of aircraft instruments beeping in the background. I'm coming home early. Emergency leave got approved. Emergency leave? Marcus, what's going on? Is everything okay? There was a pause, and when he spoke again, his voice carried that tone he'd used as kids when he was about to do something that would either get him in serious trouble or make him a legend. Remember when we were kids, and Tommy Brennan kept picking on you at school? What did I do? I smiled despite my confusion. You rode your bike to school during lunch, found him on the playground, and told him if he ever looked at me wrong again, you'd make sure everyone knew he wet his pants during the 3rd grade Christmas play. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. And what happened to Tommy Brennan after that? He never bothered me again, but Marcus, that was 20 years ago, and we're not kids anymore. No, we're not, he agreed, but some principles don't change. Nobody messes with my little sister. Not bullies on a playground, and definitely not a bunch of small-minded gossips who think they can make you feel ashamed for being human. The line crackled with static, and I heard him talking to someone else, presumably his co-pilot or flight controller. When he came back, his voice was all business. Sarah, I'm serious about going outside. In 18 minutes, I'm going to be making a very low pass over Millbrook. Low enough that car alarms are going to go off. I want you in the backyard so you can see this. Marcus, you can't just... Already cleared it with base command, he interrupted. Told them my sister was having a medical emergency, and I needed to check on her welfare. Technically, not a lie. Those people talking about you like you're damaged goods is definitely an emergency in my book. My heart was pounding, but for the first time in months, it wasn't from anxiety. How low are we talking? Low enough that you'll be able to see my helmet through the canopy. I laughed. Actually laughed for the first time since my breakdown. You're insane. Crazy runs in the family, apparently. The difference is, my kind of crazy comes with a $30 million fighter jet and the full authority of the United States Air Force. After we hung up, I stood in my kitchen, staring out the window at my quiet neighborhood. Mrs. Hoffman was watering her petunias. Mr. Peterson was mowing his lawn in perfect diagonal strips. Janet Mills was getting her mail, probably hoping to catch some new gossip from the postal worker. None of them had any idea what was about to happen. I went upstairs and changed into my favorite dress, a blue sundress that I hadn't worn since before my breakdown because it reminded me of the confident woman I used to be. Then I walked out to my backyard and waited. At exactly 2:47 p.m., I heard it. A low rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It started as a distant vibration, like thunder rolling across the sky, but it grew louder and more intense with each passing second. The birds went silent first. Then the dogs started barking. Every dog in a 6-block radius suddenly howling in confusion. Car alarms began chirping sporadically as the sound waves hit metal and glass. Mrs. Hoffman dropped her watering can and looked up at the sky with her hand shading her eyes. Mr. Peterson shut off his mower and stood frozen in his yard. I could see neighbors emerging from their houses, craning their necks upward, trying to locate the source of the increasingly thunderous noise. And then I saw it. The F-16 Fighting Falcon appeared over the tree line like something out of a movie, flying so low I could make out individual rivets on its fuselage. The aircraft was painted in standard Air Force gray, with Marcus's squadron markings clearly visible on the tail, the 388th Fighter Wing's distinctive red and yellow lightning bolt. But what made everyone stop and stare wasn't just the altitude, it was the precision. Marcus brought that $30 million piece of military hardware directly over our street, following the road like it was a runway. The jet wash from his engine stripped leaves off trees and sent garbage cans tumbling across driveways. Windows rattled in their frames. The Henderson's outdoor umbrella went flying like a tumbleweed. As the aircraft passed over my house, I could see Marcus in the cockpit, his helmet clearly visible through the canopy. He waggled the wings, a pilot's wave, and for a moment, it felt like he was looking directly at me. The entire flyover lasted maybe 15 seconds, but the effect was instantaneous and absolute. Every person who had been going about their quiet Tuesday afternoon was now standing in their yard, mouths agape, watching as one of the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world treated our suburban street like his personal aerobatic demonstration space. Mrs. Hoffman was clutching her chest, not from fear, but from sheer amazement. Mr. Peterson had his phone out, frantically trying to record something that was already disappearing over the southern horizon. Janet Mills stood frozen at her mailbox, letters scattered around her feet, staring at the sky like she'd just witnessed a miracle. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Phase 1 complete, Phase 2 in 30 seconds. Before I could process what that meant, I heard the engines again. Different this time. Not the full-throttle roar of a high-speed pass, but the controlled whine of an aircraft in landing configuration. The F-16 came back from the south, gear down, flaps extended, approaching my neighborhood like it was Edwards Air Force Base instead of a residential street in Kentucky. I watched in disbelief as Marcus lined up his approach with the empty field behind our house, a stretch of grass that belonged to the city and was used for overflow parking during the county fair. Except Marcus wasn't aiming for the field. He was coming straight for my backyard. The landing gear touched down first on the grass strip that separated my property from the Miller's house next door, then rolled directly onto my lawn. The aircraft's weight pressed deep ruts into the Kentucky bluegrass that my father had spent 30 years perfecting, but Marcus brought the fighter jet to a smooth stop, just shy of my mother's rose garden. The engine spooled down to idle, and then to silence. For a moment, the entire neighborhood held its collective breath. Birds had stopped singing. Dogs had stopped barking. Even the traffic noise from the main road seemed muted, as if the universe itself was trying to process what had just happened. Then Marcus popped the canopy. He climbed out of the cockpit with the casual confidence of someone who had just parked a car instead of landing a fighter jet in a suburban backyard. His flight suit was perfectly pressed, his boots polished to a mirror shine. He pulled off his helmet and grinned at me with the same mischievous smile he'd worn as a 10-year-old planning some elaborate prank. "Hey, sis," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly silent neighborhood. "How's the anxiety treating you today?" I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at my brother who had just turned my backyard into a military airfield and my personal crisis into the most spectacular demonstration of sibling loyalty in the history of Millbrook, Kentucky. Behind me, I could hear neighbors emerging from their houses, their voices mixing into a confused chorus of amazement and disbelief. Car doors were slamming as people rushed over to get a closer look. I heard Mrs. Hoffman telling someone on her phone, "You're not going to believe this, but there's an Air Force jet in Sarah Thompson's backyard." Marcus walked across my lawn like he owned it, his boots leaving impressions in the same grass where we'd played catch as children. When he reached me, he pulled me into a hug that smelled like jet fuel and victory. "Sorry about the lawn," he whispered in my ear. "I'll pay to have it reseeded." That's when I started crying, not from anxiety or panic or shame, but from pure, overwhelming gratitude. My brother had literally moved heaven and earth, had bent military regulations, and probably violated several FAA rules, just to remind everyone in our small town that Sarah Thompson wasn't just the woman who'd had a breakdown. I was the sister of Captain Marcus Thompson, a man who could land an F-16 Fighting Falcon in a backyard and make it look like the most natural thing in the world. Within 10 minutes of Marcus shutting down his engines, my backyard looked like the site of a small festival. Word had spread through Millbrook faster than wildfire, and it seemed like half the town had materialized on my property to gawk at the F-16. Fighting Falcon parked between my mother's prize-winning rose bushes and the old oak tree where Marcus and I used to build forts. The first to arrive were my immediate neighbors. Janet Mills, who had spent months treating me like I might spontaneously combust, now stood at the edge of my patio with her mouth hanging open, clutching her phone and snapping pictures like a tourist at the Smithsonian. "Is that really your brother?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The same woman who had been, quote, concerned about property values because of my mental health, was now staring at Marcus like he was a celebrity. "Captain Marcus Thompson, 388th Fighter Wing," I replied, enjoying the way her eyes widened. "He's been flying F-16s for 8 years. Mrs. Hoffman appeared at my garden gate, still wearing her gardening gloves and carrying the watering can she'd dropped during the flyover. She looked from the aircraft to Marcus, who was now doing what appeared to be a casual post-flight inspection of his jet, running his hands along the wing surfaces and checking various panels. "Sarah, dear," she said, and for the first time in months there was no condescension in her voice, no careful tone reserved for fragile people. "Your brother just landed a fighter jet. In your backyard." "He did," I confirmed, struggling to keep the smile off my face. Mr. Peterson jogged over from his house, his lawnmower abandoned mid-stripe. "Is everything okay? Is this some kind of emergency? Should we call someone?" Marcus looked up from his inspection and grinned. "No emergency, sir. Just visiting my sister. Hope we didn't disturb your afternoon." The casual way he said it, like landing military aircraft in residential areas, was perfectly normal, seemed to short-circuit Mr. Peterson's brain. He stood there, grass clippings still stuck to his shoes, trying to process the surreal scene in front of him. By the time the Henderson family arrived with their 3 kids in tow, followed by the Garcias from 2 streets over, then the Williamses and their elderly parents, my backyard had turned into an impromptu air show meet and greet. But the real shift in atmosphere came when Tommy Brennan showed up. Tommy hadn't changed much since high school, still had the same smirk, the same swagger, the same tendency to insert himself into situations where he wasn't wanted. He owned a construction company now, and drove a pickup truck with too many American flag decals, and he'd been one of the more vocal critics of my breakdown at Romano's Deli a few weeks earlier. "Well, well," Tommy said, pushing through the small crowd that had gathered around the F-16's nose cone. "Sarah Thompson's brother comes home to check on the family invalid." The word invalid hung in the air like a slap. Several people turned to look at him, their expressions shifting from curious to uncomfortable. Marcus, who had been explaining the aircraft's targeting system to the Henderson kids, went very still. "Excuse me?" Marcus said, straightening to his full height. In his flight suit, with his captain's bars clearly visible and $30 million worth of lethal military hardware as a backdrop, he looked like every action movie hero ever cast. Tommy, apparently oblivious to the fact that he was picking a fight with someone who flew fighter jets for a living, doubled down. "I mean, it's nice that you came to visit, but some of us have been dealing with Sarah's episodes for months now. Must be nice to swoop in and play the hero when the rest of us have been walking on eggshells." The crowd fell silent. Even the Henderson kids stopped asking questions about missiles and ejection seats. I felt my face flush with the familiar heat of shame, the same feeling I'd carried for months every time someone referenced my breakdown. But Marcus just smiled, the same dangerous smile he'd worn before confronting Tommy on the playground 20 years earlier. "Episodes," Marcus repeated, his voice conversationally light. "That's an interesting way to describe someone working themselves to exhaustion in service of other people's success." He took a step closer to Tommy, who suddenly seemed to realize he might have miscalculated. "Tell me, Tommy, what exactly have you been dealing with?" Quote, "Well, I mean, the crying in public, the medication, all that mental health stuff. It's been hard on everyone." "Hard on everyone," Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Let me make sure I understand. My sister worked 14-hour days for 4 years, generated millions in revenue for her company, built a reputation as one of the most successful marketing professionals in the region, and when her body finally said, 'enough,' and she sought medical treatment for a stress-related condition, that was hard on you?" Tommy's smirk was starting to fade. "I didn't mean..." "Because from where I'm standing," Marcus continued, his voice still pleasant, but with an edge that could cut glass, "it looks like the only thing that was hard for you was finding something new to gossip about. Must have been disappointing when Sarah started getting better, and you lost your favorite topic of conversation." The crowd was watching this exchange like a tennis match, heads turning back and forth between Tommy and Marcus. I could see Mrs. Hoffman nodding slightly, as if she was finally understanding something she'd missed before. Marcus gestured casually toward his aircraft. "You know what's interesting about flying fighters, Tommy? It requires absolute mental precision. Split-second decision-making under extreme pressure. The kind of cognitive demand that would break most people in about 15 minutes. He paused, letting that sink in. The Air Force doesn't let people with weak minds fly these machines. We undergo psychological evaluation every 6 months. Stress testing. Mental resilience training. He took another step toward Tommy, who was now looking like he wanted to disappear. And you know what every flight surgeon in the military will tell you? The strongest people are the ones who recognize when they need help and have the courage to seek it. Weakness isn't having a panic attack. Weakness is suffering in silence and pretending everything's fine. The silence stretched out until Mrs. Hoffman cleared her throat. I think, she said slowly, we owe Sarah an apology, all of us. Now hold on, Tommy started, but Mrs. Hoffman cut him off with a look that could have stopped traffic. No, Tom Brennan, you hold on. This young woman worked herself sick, trying to be perfect for everyone else. And instead of supporting her while she got better, we turned her struggle into entertainment. She looked directly at me, her eyes filled with something I hadn't seen there in months. Respect. Sarah, I'm ashamed of how I've behaved, how we've all behaved. Maria Romano, who had apparently arrived while Marcus was delivering his impromptu lecture on military psychology, stepped forward. Mrs. Hoffman is right. Sarah, honey, I'm so sorry. The way we've been talking, like you were some kind of curiosity instead of a person going through a hard time, it wasn't right. One by one, other neighbors began speaking up. Mr. Peterson apologized for avoiding eye contact at the hardware store. The Garcias admitted they'd been crossing the street to avoid awkward conversations. Even some of the teenagers who had gathered to take selfies with the fighter jet looked embarrassed as they realized they were witnessing grown adults acknowledging their own cruelty. But the moment that really broke me was when 8-year-old Emma Henderson tugged on her mother's sleeve and asked, loud enough for everyone to hear, Mom, why were people being mean to Miss Sarah for being sick? When I had pneumonia, everyone brought me soup and coloring books. The adults exchanged glances, and I saw several people wipe their eyes. Out of the mouths of babes, as my grandmother used to say. Marcus walked over and put his arm around my shoulders. Sarah's not broken, he announced to the assembled crowd. She's healing. There's a difference. And anyone who can't see that might want to take a long look in the mirror and ask themselves what they're really afraid of. Tommy mumbled something that might have been an apology and slunk away, but the rest of the neighbors stayed. What started as an awkward confrontation gradually transformed into something I hadn't experienced in months. Normal conversation. People began asking genuine questions about my recovery, about therapy, about what they could do to be better neighbors. The Hendersons invited me to Emma's birthday party the following weekend. Maria Romano insisted I come by the deli for lunch, in the house, and I want to hear all about your brother's flying stories. Mrs. Hoffman, who had been the source of so much neighborhood gossip, pulled me aside as the crowd began to thin out. Sarah, I want you to know something. My late husband, God rest his soul, struggled with depression for years after he came back from Korea. Back then, we didn't talk about such things. He suffered alone, and I think maybe if he'd had the courage to get help the way you did, he might have lived longer and been happier. She squeezed my hand with surprising strength. What you did, getting treatment, taking care of yourself, that took guts. I should have seen that months ago. As the sun began to set over Millbrook, casting long shadows across my battle-scarred lawn, I realized something had fundamentally shifted. Not just in how my neighbors saw me, but in how I saw myself. For months, I'd been carrying their judgment like a weight, letting their whispers define who I was. But watching Marcus defend me with such fierce certainty, seeing the shame on people's faces as they realized their own cruelty, I understood something I'd forgotten during the darkest days of my recovery. I wasn't the problem. I had never been the problem. The problem was a culture that treated mental health like a moral failing instead of a medical condition. The problem was small-minded people who found comfort in judging others instead of examining their own lives. The problem was a society that celebrated working yourself to death and then mocked you for seeking help when the inevitable breakdown came. Marcus had done more than just land a fighter jet in my backyard. He'd forced an entire community to confront their own prejudices and cowardice. And in doing so, he'd given me back something I thought I'd lost forever. My sense of self-worth. The F-16 sat silent in my yard as darkness fell, a $30 million monument to the power of unconditional love and the importance of having someone in your corner who will go to literally any length to defend you. Tomorrow, Marcus would have to figure out how to get his aircraft back to base. Tonight, we were going to order pizza and sit in my living room, just like we used to as kids, while he told me stories about flying and I told him about healing. And for the first time in months, I wasn't afraid of what the neighbors might say. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of helicopters. Not one helicopter, 3 of them, circling my neighborhood like mechanical vultures. I stumbled to my bedroom window and peered through the blinds to see news vans lining Maple Street, their satellite dishes extended toward the sky like metallic flowers reaching for the sun. The F-16 was still there, of course, looking even more surreal in the soft morning light. Dew had collected on its wings, and a curious squirrel was investigating the landing gear with scientific interest. But now, my quiet suburban street looked like the setup for a major news event. My phone had been buzzing incessantly since 6 a.m. Missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize, text messages from high school classmates I hadn't spoken to in years, and voicemails from what sounded like reporters. The story had gone viral overnight. Marcus emerged from my guest bedroom looking remarkably refreshed for someone who had potentially ended his military career the day before. He was wearing civilian clothes, jeans, and a Kentucky Wildcats t-shirt, and carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Sleep well?" he asked, handing me a mug. "How are you so calm right now?" I gestured toward the window. "There are news helicopters circling my house like we're in the middle of a federal standoff." He shrugged. "I've been expecting this. Word was bound to get out. A fighter jet landing in a residential area isn't exactly something you can keep quiet." He took a sip of his coffee and grinned. "Besides, I already talked to Colonel Martinez this morning. Turns out the Air Force is more interested in the positive publicity than they are in court-martialing me." Positive publicity? Think about it, Sarah. The story isn't rogue pilot violates airspace. The story is military hero defends sister against small-town bullies. The recruitment office is probably loving this. As if on cue, my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see a perfectly groomed woman in a red blazer holding a microphone, flanked by a cameraman and what looked like a producer with a clipboard. "Sarah Thompson," the woman called through the door. "I'm Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7 News. We'd love to speak with you about yesterday's events." I looked at Marcus, who nodded encouragingly. "Might as well get ahead of the story," he said. "Control the narrative instead of letting someone else write it for you." 20 minutes later, I found myself sitting on my front porch with Jennifer Walsh, trying not to stare directly into the camera lens that was documenting what she kept calling an extraordinary demonstration of family loyalty. "Sarah, when your brother landed that F-16 in your backyard yesterday, what went through your mind?" Jennifer asked, her voice carrying that practiced tone of concerned professionalism that news anchors perfect. "Honestly, I thought he'd lost his mind," I admitted, which made Jennifer laugh, a genuine sound that put me at ease. But then I realized he was trying to remind everyone, including me, that having anxiety doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. "Tell us about the struggles you've faced with mental health in your community." This was the moment I'd been dreading, the moment where I'd have to publicly acknowledge my breakdown, my therapy, my medication, all the things that had made me a subject of gossip and pity for months. But sitting there with the F-16 visible in my backyard and Marcus standing just off camera giving me an encouraging thumbs up, I felt something I hadn't experienced in almost a year. Power. "I had a panic attack during a business presentation," I said, looking directly into the camera. "It was terrifying and embarrassing, and I ended up needing medical treatment for severe anxiety disorder. In a small town like Millbrook, that kind of thing becomes everyone's business very quickly." How did the community react? Not well, initially. There's still a lot of stigma around mental health, especially in smaller communities. People treated me like I was fragile, or worse, like I was contagious, like mental illness was something that might spread if they got too close. Jennifer leaned forward slightly. "And how has that changed since yesterday?" I glanced over at Mrs. Hoffman, who was watching the interview from her front yard while watering her petunias. She gave me a small wave and a smile, a real smile, not the pitying grimace I'd grown accustomed to. "Yesterday, my brother didn't just land a jet in my backyard. He landed it right in the middle of everyone's assumptions about what strength looks like. He showed this community that the strongest person in my family isn't the one who flies fighter jets. It's the one who had the courage to say, "I need help," when everything was falling apart. The interview continued for another 10 minutes, covering Marcus's military service, the logistics of landing an F-16 in a residential area, and what the Air Force's response had been. But the moment that would end up being replayed on news stations across the country came when Jennifer asked her final question. "What do you want people to take away from this story?" I thought about all the people who might be watching. Other people struggling with anxiety, depression, PTSD, or any of the countless ways that mental illness can manifest. People who were suffering in silence because they were afraid of becoming the subject of gossip and judgment. Mental health is health, I said simply. If I'd had a heart attack during that presentation, people would have sent flowers and casseroles. They would have asked about my recovery and celebrated my return to work. But because my collapse was psychological instead of physical, I became a cautionary tale instead of a success story. I looked directly into the camera lens, imagining all the people who might be watching from their own quiet desperation. If you're struggling, get help. Don't let other people's ignorance become your prison. And if you're one of those people who thinks mental illness is a character flaw, maybe it's time to examine your own character instead. The interview wrapped up just as 3 more news vans arrived on Maple Street. By noon, there were reporters from CNN, Fox News, and what looked like every local station within a 200-mile radius. My quiet neighborhood had become a media circus. But something interesting happened as the day progressed. Instead of hiding from the cameras, my neighbors began coming forward to be interviewed. Mrs. Hoffman spoke eloquently about her late husband's struggles with depression and how the community's reaction to my situation had made her realize how much suffering might have been prevented with more understanding and less judgment. Mr. Peterson, who had initially been terrified that the military was staging some kind of intervention, now proudly showed reporters the video he'd taken of Marcus's landing, calling it the most incredible thing I've ever witnessed in 40 years of living on this street. Even more surprising was the response from beyond Millbrook. My phone rang constantly with calls from people across the country who had seen the story and wanted to share their own experiences with mental health stigma. A woman from Oregon called to tell me about losing her job after a PTSD diagnosis. A man from Florida described being ostracized by his church congregation after seeking treatment for depression. But there were positive calls too. A veterans organization in Texas wanted to invite Marcus to speak at their annual conference. A mental health advocacy group in California asked if I'd be willing to share my story at their upcoming fundraising event. By the 3rd day, the media attention had evolved into something neither Marcus nor I had anticipated. We weren't just a human interest story about sibling loyalty anymore. We'd become inadvertent spokespersons for a national conversation about mental health stigma. Dr. Morrison called me on Thursday morning, her voice bright with excitement. "Sarah, I've had 12 new patients contact me this week, all of them mentioning your interview. They said hearing you talk about therapy made them realize it was okay to seek help." The local impact was even more profound. The Millbrook Community Center announced they were starting a mental health support group, led by retired therapist Helen Crawford, who had moved to town the previous year. The group's first meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and they already had 15 people signed up. Tommy Brennan, apparently feeling the weight of public judgment for his behavior during the news interviews, made a point of stopping by Romano's Deli while I was there picking up lunch. In front of a crowd of customers, he apologized publicly for his comments and announced that his construction company would be donating materials for a meditation garden at the community center. "It's not much," he said, his face red with embarrassment, "but I figure if we're going to talk about mental health in this town, we might as well create a peaceful place for people to do it." The most unexpected development came on Friday, when a black sedan with government plates pulled up to my house. 2 men in suits got out, followed by a woman in an Air Force uniform with stars on her collar. Brigadier General Patricia Williams, it turned out, was Marcus's commanding officer's commanding officer. She'd flown in from Washington specifically to meet with us. "Captain Thompson," she said, shaking Marcus's hand with a grip that looked like it could crush walnuts, "you've created quite a situation." Marcus straightened to attention. "Yes, ma'am, I take full responsibility for my actions." General Williams studied him for a moment, then broke into a smile. Relax, Captain. You're not in trouble. In fact, the Pentagon wants to discuss using this incident as the foundation for a new military family support initiative. She turned to me. Ms. Thompson, your brother's actions and your subsequent interviews have generated more positive publicity for military mental health programs than our entire PR department has managed in the past 5 years. The Secretary of Defense is very interested in expanding support services for military families dealing with similar challenges. What had started as Marcus's impulsive decision to defend his little sister had somehow evolved into a national policy discussion. The fighter jet in my backyard, which should have been evidence of his reckless disregard for regulations, was now being held up as a symbol of the military's commitment to supporting its personnel and their families. That evening, as the last news van finally pulled away from Maple Street and the helicopters disappeared into the distance, Marcus and I sat on my back porch looking at the F-16 that had started it all. Tomorrow, a team from the Air Force would arrive to figure out how to get it back to base, apparently involving a temporary runway constructed in the field behind our house and a very careful takeoff procedure. So, I said, sipping a glass of wine and watching the sunset reflect off the aircraft's canopy, any regrets about ending your quiet military career to become an accidental activist? Marcus laughed. Are you kidding? This is the most fun I've had since flight school. Besides, he added, his expression growing serious, seeing you in that interview, watching you take control of your own story, and use it to help other people, that's worth more than any promotion the Air Force could offer. He was right. Something fundamental had shifted over the past week. I was no longer Sarah Thompson, the woman who'd had a nervous breakdown. I was Sarah Thompson, the woman who'd had the courage to seek help, to be vulnerable in public, and to transform her personal struggle into a platform for change. The panic attacks hadn't disappeared completely, and I was still taking medication, still seeing Dr. Morrison twice a week. But now those things felt like tools in my recovery toolkit, rather than evidence of my failure. Most importantly, I'd learned that the opinion of small-minded people holds exactly as much power as you choose to give it, and I was choosing to give it none at all. The F-16 Fighting Falcon sitting in my backyard wasn't just a symbol of my brother's love and protection. It was a $30 million reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary gestures come from the simplest truths, that everyone deserves to be defended, that mental health matters, and that the right person in your corner can quite literally move mountains. Or in this case, land fighter jets. 6 months after Marcus turned my backyard into an impromptu airfield, I stood in the boardroom of Henderson Marketing Solutions, looking out at the same 43 faces that had witnessed my breakdown a year earlier. But this time, instead of quarterly projections, I was presenting something entirely different. The Thompson Initiative, I announced, clicking to the first slide of my presentation, represents a fundamental shift in how we approach employee mental health and workplace stress management. Richard Kellerman, my former boss, who had awkwardly shuffled me out of that disastrous meeting 12 months ago, now sat at the head of the conference table with an expression of intense interest. The company had invited me back, not as an employee, but as a consultant hired to develop their new corporate wellness program. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same breakdown that had made me a pariah in this building was now being leveraged as expertise. The program consists of 3 core components, I continued, my voice steady and confident. Proactive stress management, destigmatized mental health resources, and what we're calling resilience partnerships, a buddy system that pairs employees with trained mental health advocates within the company. Jennifer from accounting, who had helped me out of this very room during my panic attack, raised her hand. Sarah, how do we implement something like this without making employees feel like they're being monitored or judged? It was exactly the kind of thoughtful question I'd hoped for. The key is voluntary participation and absolute confidentiality. We're not creating a system to identify problem employees. We're creating a culture where seeking help is seen as professional development, not personal failure. The presentation continued for another 30 minutes. Covering everything from meditation spaces in the office to flexible work schedules for people managing anxiety disorders. But the moment that really drove the point home came when I shared the data I'd collected over the past 6 months. Since the story of my breakdown and recovery went public, I've received over 3,000 emails from people sharing their own experiences with workplace mental health challenges. I said, clicking to a slide filled with statistics. 67% reported hiding their mental health treatment from employers due to fear of discrimination. 41% said they'd considered changing careers rather than seeking help. The room was silent, and I could see people processing the magnitude of what I was describing. These weren't abstract statistics. These were their colleagues, their friends, potentially themselves. But here's what's really interesting, I continued. Companies that have implemented comprehensive mental health programs report a 23% increase in productivity, a 38% decrease in sick days, and a 47% improvement in employee retention. After the presentation, Richard pulled me aside in the hallway where we'd had so many rushed conversations about deadlines and client demands. "Sarah, I owe you an apology," he said, his usual corporate bravado replaced by something more genuine. When you were struggling, I didn't know how to handle it. I was so focused on damage control and keeping clients happy that I forgot you were a person, not just an employee. "You weren't trained for it," I replied, surprising myself with how little resentment I felt. "Most managers aren't. That's part of what needs to change." He nodded thoughtfully. "The board approved your proposal unanimously, by the way. We want to implement the Thompson Initiative company-wide, starting next month. And Sarah?" He paused, looking almost embarrassed. "We'd like you to consider coming back. Not to your old position, but as our Director of Employee Wellness. It's a newly created role, and frankly, there's no one more qualified." The offer was tempting. A chance to return to the corporate world on my own terms, to transform the very environment that had nearly broken me. But I'd learned something important about myself over the past year. I was done living my life according to other people's definitions of success. "I appreciate the offer, Richard, but I've got other plans." Those other plans had crystallized over the winter months, as speaking requests continued to pour in from across the country. What had started as a single television interview had evolved into a full-time advocacy career. I'd spoken at universities, corporate conferences, and military bases, sharing my story and working to change how organizations approached mental health. The most meaningful invitation had come from Dr. Patricia Morrison, who asked me to co-author a research study on community-based mental health stigma. Our paper, From Breakdown to Breakthrough: Social Support Systems in Rural Mental Health Recovery, was being published in the Journal of Community Psychology. But the project I was most excited about was happening right here in Millbrook. The empty storefront next to Romano's Deli had been transformed into something unprecedented in our small town's history: the Millbrook Mental Health Resource Center. What had started as Mrs. Hoffman's community support group had grown into a comprehensive facility offering counseling services, support groups, educational workshops, and what we called crisis intervention training for local business owners and community leaders. The grand opening was scheduled for the following weekend, and Marcus was flying in from his new assignment in Colorado to cut the ribbon. His backyard landing incident, as it was now officially known in Air Force records, had indeed led to a promotion rather than a court-martial. He was now Major Marcus Thompson, assigned to develop new protocols for military family crisis response. The center's waiting room featured a large framed photograph of the F-16 in my backyard, donated by Mr. Peterson, who had turned his shaky cell phone video into a surprisingly artistic print. Below it, a plaque read, "Sometimes the most extraordinary support comes from the most unexpected places." Dr. Morrison had agreed to serve as the center's clinical director, working alongside 3 other therapists we'd recruited from Louisville and Lexington. But what made the facility truly special wasn't the professional staff. It was the peer counselors. Tommy Brennan had surprised everyone by volunteering for the program. After completing 40 hours of training, he now led a support group for business owners struggling with stress and anxiety. His construction company had become one of the most progressive employers in the county, offering mental health days and flexible scheduling for workers dealing with personal challenges. "Turns out," he told me during one of our planning meetings, "when you stop being an ass long enough to actually listen to people, you learn that everybody's fighting some kind of battle." Even more surprising was Janet Mills' transformation. The woman who had once worried about property values due to my mental episodes was now the center's volunteer coordinator and had become one of the most effective advocates for mental health awareness in the region. "I spent so many years being afraid of other people's problems," she admitted during our soft opening event. I thought if I acknowledged mental illness, somehow it would make me vulnerable to it. But what I learned from watching your recovery is that vulnerability isn't weakness, it's courage. The center's impact extended far beyond Millbrook. We'd received funding requests from similar-sized communities across Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio, all wanting to replicate our model. The state health department had even asked us to develop a training manual for rural mental health initiatives. But perhaps the most gratifying development was personal. My relationship with my parents, which had been strained during the worst days of my breakdown, had not only healed but deepened. Mom had started attending family therapy sessions with me, working through her own anxiety about my mental health, and learning how to be supportive without being overprotective. Dad, who had initially struggled with the public nature of my story, became one of my fiercest advocates after attending one of my speaking engagements. "I never understood what you went through," he told me after my presentation at the Louisville Veterans Center. "But seeing you up there, helping other people who are struggling the way you did, I've never been prouder to be your father." The speaking engagement that changed everything, though, was the one I almost didn't accept. The invitation came from Stanford University's medical school, asking me to address their graduating class of psychiatrists and psychologists. The topic: the patient perspective, how mental health stigma affects treatment outcomes. Standing at the podium in front of 200 future mental health professionals, I found myself thinking about that day in the conference room when my mind went blank and my career fell apart. How terrified I'd been, how ashamed, how certain that my life was effectively over. "Mental illness doesn't discriminate," I told the graduating students. "It affects CEOs and construction workers, teachers and soldiers, parents and teenagers. But stigma does discriminate. It targets the vulnerable, the isolated, the people who are already struggling to stay afloat." I clicked on a slide showing the Millbrook Mental Health Resource Center, packed with people attending various support groups and workshops. This facility exists because one person, my brother, refused to let me disappear into shame and isolation. But imagine if we lived in a world where that kind of intervention wasn't necessary, where seeking mental health treatment was as normal and accepted as getting a broken bone set or taking antibiotics for an infection. The audience was completely silent, and I could see several students wiping their eyes. "You have the power to create that world," I continued. "Every patient you treat with dignity instead of pity, every family you educate instead of patronize, every community leader you train to recognize mental health crises. You're building a society where people like me don't have to wait for fighter jets to land in their backyards to feel worthy of support." After the presentation, a young psychiatrist approached me with tears in her eyes. "My brother committed suicide 2 years ago," she said quietly. "He was struggling with depression, but he was too ashamed to tell anyone. If he'd had someone like you speaking up, maybe." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. That conversation became the inspiration for my next project, a national campaign called Before the Crisis, focused on early intervention and community education. As I drove back to Millbrook that evening, I thought about the strange journey that had brought me to this point. A year and a half ago, I'd been a successful marketing executive who measured her worth by quarterly numbers and client satisfaction scores. Now I was measuring my impact by the number of people who felt safe enough to seek help, by communities that were learning to support instead of stigmatize, by families who were having conversations about mental health instead of suffering in silence. The panic attacks still came occasionally, usually triggered by travel stress or major life changes. But now they felt like weather, temporary conditions that would pass, not permanent judgments on my character or capabilities. Dr. Morrison often said that healing isn't about returning to who you were before trauma or illness. It's about integrating your experiences into a stronger, more authentic version of yourself. Looking back, I realized that's exactly what had happened. I hadn't just recovered from my breakdown, I'd been transformed by it. The woman driving home to Millbrook that night was someone I never could have become without first falling apart completely. And sometimes, when I was feeling particularly grateful for the strange turns my life had taken, I'd walk out to my backyard and look at the spot where Marcus had landed his F-16. The grass had grown back, but if you knew where to look, you could still see the faint impressions on the earth, where $30 million worth of military aircraft had touched down to defend a sister's dignity. The neighbors had stopped talking about it as the day Sarah Thompson had a breakdown. Now they called it the day she found her wings. 2 years after the incident that changed everything, I found myself standing in the Rose Garden of the White House, waiting to meet the President of the United States. The invitation had arrived on official letterhead 3 weeks earlier, requesting my presence at a bill signing ceremony for the National Mental Health Awareness and Support Act, legislation that had been directly inspired by the media coverage of Marcus's dramatic intervention and the community transformation that followed. Ms. Thompson? A Secret Service agent approached with the kind of polite efficiency that suggested he'd escorted hundreds of civilians through this process. The president is ready to see you. As we walked through the corridors of power, past portraits of former presidents and historical artifacts that belonged in museums, I thought about the phone call that had started it all. Marcus asking me to step outside, the sound of jet engines, the moment when everything I thought I knew about strength and vulnerability got turned upside down. President Harrison was shorter than he appeared on television, but his handshake was firm, and his smile genuine as he greeted the small group of mental health advocates gathered for the ceremony. Ms. Thompson, he said, your story has been instrumental in building public support for this legislation. The work you've done in Kentucky, the research you've published, the communities you've helped transform, it's exactly the kind of grassroots change that makes national policy possible. The bill he was about to sign into law would establish federal funding for community mental health centers in underserved areas, create training programs for crisis intervention, and require insurance companies to provide equal coverage for mental and physical health services. It wasn't everything advocates had hoped for, but it was a significant step forward. During the signing ceremony, as cameras flashed and officials made speeches about the importance of mental health awareness, I found myself thinking about all the people who had contributed to this moment. Dr. Morrison, who had guided me through my darkest days and later became my research partner. Mrs. Hoffman, whose willingness to examine her own prejudices had sparked community-wide change. Tommy Brennan, who had transformed from tormentor to ally. Janet Mills, who had overcome her own fears to become an advocate for others. But mostly, I thought about Marcus, who was currently deployed in Germany and couldn't attend the ceremony. His willingness to risk his career for my dignity had created ripples that extended far beyond either of us could have imagined. After the official ceremony, I was invited to join a smaller meeting with congressional leaders and mental health organizations to discuss implementation of the new legislation. Sitting around a conference table in the West Wing, listening to senators and representatives debate funding allocations and program priorities, I had one of those surreal moments where you step outside yourself and wonder how you ended up in a particular situation. 3 years ago, I'd been a marketing executive whose biggest concerns were quarterly targets and client retention. Now I was providing input on federal mental health policy and serving as a liaison between government officials and grassroots advocacy groups. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, periods of exhaustion, and times when the weight of being a public figure in the mental health space felt overwhelming. Speaking about your personal struggles to strangers was emotionally draining, even when you knew it was helping people. But there had also been moments of profound connection and purpose that made every challenge worthwhile. Like the email I'd received from a high school student in Montana whose teacher had shown my Stanford University speech to their psychology class. The student, Maria Gonzalez, had been struggling with anxiety and was afraid to tell her parents. After watching my talk, she found the courage to seek help and was now thriving in her senior year. Or the phone call from Colonel Janet Washington, the first female commanding officer to implement comprehensive mental health support protocols for military families, based on the research Marcus and I had collaborated on. Her program had become a model for bases across the country. Or the letter from Tom Bradley, the pharmacist in Millbrook who had once avoided eye contact when filling my prescriptions. He'd written to tell me that his own daughter had been struggling with depression, and our community center had given him the tools to support her, instead of feeling helpless and afraid. These individual stories had multiplied exponentially as the movement grew. The Millbrook model had been replicated in over 200 communities across 15 states. Our training materials were being translated into Spanish and distributed through community health centers in Texas and California. A documentary film crew had followed our work for 6 months, creating a feature-length film that premiered at Sundance and was later distributed to schools and organizations nationwide. The most unexpected development had been the international interest. I'd received invitations to speak in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia, where similar rural mental health initiatives were being developed. A research collaboration with the University of Edinburgh was studying how community-based interventions could be adapted for different cultural contexts. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition had come from an unexpected source. During my flight back to Kentucky from Washington, I received a text message that made me smile for the entire 3-hour journey home. "Proud of you, sis. Wish I could have been there to see you change the world. Major M. Thompson, currently somewhere over the Atlantic." Marcus had been promoted again and was now serving as a liaison between the Air Force and international partners, developing crisis response protocols for military families stationed overseas. His backyard landing had become legendary within the Air Force, not as an example of insubordination, but as a case study in creative problem-solving and family loyalty. He'd called me the previous week from Ramstein Air Base in Germany, where he was training European military personnel in the family support protocols we'd developed together. "You know what's funny?" he'd said during our video call. "I thought I was just trying to shut up some gossipy neighbors. I had no idea I was launching your political career." "It's not a political career," I protested. "It's advocacy work. Sarah, you just influenced federal legislation, and you're being invited to the White House. That's politics, whether you want to admit it or not." He wasn't wrong. Over the past year, I'd found myself increasingly involved in policy discussions, not because I'd sought out political involvement, but because effective advocacy inevitably leads to systemic change. The personal had become political, as the saying goes. The plane descended through the clouds toward Louisville, and I could see the familiar landscape of Kentucky spreading out below: the rolling hills, the patchwork farmland, the suburban developments that had grown up around military installations and manufacturing plants. Somewhere down there was Millbrook, population 8,000, where the Mental Health Resource Center was now hosting its 3rd annual Community Wellness Festival, where Mrs. Hoffman served as president of the town council and had made mental health awareness a municipal priority, where Tommy Brennan's construction company had just broken ground on a new therapeutic recreation center, funded by a combination of federal grants and private donations, where my parents still lived in the same house where Marcus and I had grown up, and where they now hosted monthly dinners for the families of military personnel dealing with deployment-related stress. The transformation of one small town had become a template for communities across the country, but it had all started with one person's refusal to accept that his sister should suffer in silence and shame. As the plane touched down in Louisville, I thought about the speech I'd be giving the next morning at the University of Kentucky Medical School. The topic was "From Patient to Policy: How Personal Experience Shapes Public Health," and I'd be addressing an audience of medical students, residents, and practicing physicians. The central message would be one I'd refined over hundreds of presentations: that the people most qualified to solve problems are often those who have lived through them. That expertise doesn't only come from textbooks and clinical training, but also from the hard-won wisdom of survival and recovery. My phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Morrison. "Saw the White House coverage on the news. Proud of how far you've come. See you at the center tomorrow for the board meeting." The Millbrook Mental Health Resource Center had grown beyond our wildest expectations, now serving as a regional hub for mental health services and training. Dr. Morrison had stepped down from day-to-day clinical work to focus on research and program development, while I balanced my advocacy work with serving as the center's executive director. We'd just received a $2.3 million federal grant to expand our services and create satellite locations in 3 neighboring counties. The funding would allow us to hire additional therapists, develop new programs for adolescents and veterans, and establish Kentucky's first rural mental health crisis response team. But the statistic I was most proud of wasn't about funding or program expansion. It was simpler and more profound. In the 2 years since our center opened, not a single person in our service area had died by suicide. Not one. That number represented countless individual decisions to seek help instead of suffering alone, families who had learned to recognize warning signs and provide support, and a community that had transformed shame into compassion. As I drove the familiar route from Louisville to Millbrook, past the same landmarks I'd seen thousands of times, I thought about resilience, not just individual resilience, but collective resilience. The capacity of communities to heal themselves, to learn from crisis, to become stronger and more compassionate in the aftermath of trauma. My breakdown in that corporate conference room had felt like an ending at the time, the end of my career, my reputation, my sense of self-worth. But it had actually been a beginning. The beginning of a more authentic life, a more meaningful career, and a deeper understanding of what it means to be human in a world that often demands impossible perfection. The F-16 had taken off from my backyard 18 months ago, carefully guided out by Air Force personnel who turned the field behind our house into a temporary runway. But the impact of its landing would last forever, in changed lives, transformed communities, and new policies that would help ensure that other people in crisis received support instead of judgment. As I pulled into my driveway, I could see lights on in the community center down the street, where tonight's support groups were meeting. Somewhere in those rooms, people were sharing their struggles and finding connection. Others were learning coping strategies, rebuilding relationships, or simply discovering that they weren't alone in their battles. The woman who walked into her house that evening was fundamentally different from the one who had stood frozen in a conference room 3 years earlier, unable to remember her presentation or understand why her mind had betrayed her. That woman had measured her worth by external validation and lived in fear of showing weakness. This woman understood that vulnerability is not the opposite of strength. It's the birthplace of courage, creativity, and change. Marcus had been right that day when he told our neighbors that the strongest people are those who recognize when they need help and have the courage to seek it. But what he couldn't have known then was that sometimes, when you're brave enough to share your struggle, you don't just heal yourself. You heal the world around you, one person, one family, one community at a time. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, that healing ripples outward until it reaches the halls of power and changes the laws that govern how we care for each other. The fighter jet was long gone, but its message remained. Everyone deserves to be defended. Everyone deserves support. And sometimes the most extraordinary changes begin with the simplest act of love, showing up for someone when they need you most. As I settled into my favorite chair with a cup of tea, I opened my laptop to work on tomorrow's speech. But first, I typed a quick email to Marcus, wherever he was in the world, carrying out his own mission of service and protection. Thank you, I wrote, for teaching me that falling apart isn't the end of the story. Sometimes it's just the beginning of flying. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.